Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. It is early on a Friday. I'm very excited for today's conversation. Today we're speaking with Terry Robinson. He is a leading neuroscientist whose pioneering work on the brain mechanisms of addiction and reward has shaped how we understand compulsive behavior. He's currently the Elliott S. Valenstein Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. With a strong foundation in biopsychology and decades of research experience, he has brought nuance to debates about free will, neuroplasticity, and the long term impact of drug exposure. His career offers rich insights into how brain and behavior interact and what that means for science, public health, and education. I am so excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
Very good. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we were just talking about your lovely home. I have been fascinated by just the construction, and you're calling out of Italy, and you've navigated both spaces, being in Ann Arbor for a long time in Italy. What do you feel like are some of the inspirations you take from your time in Italy that you bring back to your work sometimes?
Uh, well, I really spent a lot of the time here, after retirement, so it's
Mm,
uh, it's not quite the same. I mean, the one thing that changed over the years, of course, is the ability to work remotely, and without that and platforms like we're using right now with Zoom, it would be very, very difficult. But that's made a huge difference in terms of being able to work and write and access the library and so on and so on, all remotely. And so that's been an advantage in that respect.
yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because you had said earlier that you were a professor for 45 years, which means you started in the field in the 80s, perhaps even in the 70s.
I went to
I'm really
Michigan.
curious.
I went to Michigan in 1978 as a new assistant
Okay.
professor. Yeah.
Whoa. Okay, so it's been 47 years. I mean, and then so I'm fascinated. I think anytime I've been thinking about this even being in education now that I'm not that old, but I've seen a few changes in my life already from the Bush years to Obama to then Trump, especially in policy when it comes to how education has changed. And there's something that's so beautiful when you get that only comes through aging, which is you get to observe how these things change over time and you actually learn about change itself. And so I'm really curious to just even start with where was neuroscience when you entered, and what do you feel like are some of the biggest changes that's happened in these 47 years?
There's too many to enumerate. I mean, some of the biggest changes. Well, let me start by saying the questions themselves are pretty much the same. So the questions that people are interested are pretty much the same. Where the big changes have come is in the methods that you can apply to answer them. And so just in the last 10 years, 10 15 years, there's just been an explosion of methods in neuroscience that allow you to address questions at a cell and molecular and systems neuroscience level that just wasn't possible back when I started, almost 50 years ago. I mean, 50 years ago, the standard methods basically were take it out, lesion it, and see what happens in terms of a brain structure, or stimulate it, often electrically or chemically, pharmacologically, and that was pretty much it. You know, those techniques are still applied, but with a level of precision using optogenetics or chemogenetics kinds of approaches now that we didn't even think of back then. Uh, but the questions themselves, the experimental design, what's good and appropriate experimental design, the importance of controls and so on, that's all pretty much the same. But the level of precision with which one can manipulate brain now is nothing like it was when I started off.
Hmm. When you say that the questions have been the same, does that mean that conclusive answers haven't been found, or is that something that is just intrinsic in neuroscience questioning?
There's In terms of any big questions, no, we don't know still much about how the brain works. We know a lot more than we did, 40, 50 years ago, and a lot more detail. But in terms of big sort of behavioral and psychological questions, how do we see things? How do we remember things? The big questions in psychology, we still don't understand that. We know a lot more about the constraints, about the systems that are involved, but how it really works, we still
Mm,
do not understand those questions. Now, if you go at a much more cellular, molecular kind of level, like how cells, neurons work in terms of their intrinsic function, yeah, there's answers to all kinds of those questions that we know and understand and have answered, definitively all kinds of questions. But that's at a sort of at the mechanics kind of level of brain versus how does it do what it was built to do, which is to mediate behavioral and psychological function.
mm.
And that we don't have answers.
I guess something that just came to my mind right now is I'm so curious what the limitations of human understanding is, and at what point do we start reaching? I've just always been fascinated by that because I always think our brains are just the most complex thing ever, and it's capable, given enough time and resources, to understand everything in the universe, which is obviously naive and probably very hopeful. But even things like, I'm curious if you feel like, is there a limitation where our brains, as they are now, can't comprehend certain things of how the brain functions?
Who knows?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's. I mean the answer is probably surely yes. There's limits. I mean, we're biological entities with limits. Uh, but
we're
if
not
you
close.
if you look, we haven't been around for that long on the planet, and if you look just over the last 100 years, the changes in in society and technology and so on, it's almost inconceivable. Now,
Yeah.
if you extrapolate that for the next 100 years, is it going to be exponentially more or not? Or are we going to plateau? Are we going to destroy ourselves? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean it is just really fascinating to think. Do you feel like in these 47 years you have seen a public shift in how neuroscience is viewed, what people think it is, just awareness of neuroscience in general?
Yes, I mean, it sort of seeps, through all kinds of media and so on. It seeps into the public mind. So most people now sort of know what a neuron is, or will have heard of something like dopamine. They'll at least, know that that's a chemical in the brain. Uh, but the level of understanding is still you know, pretty low in terms of the general public. But I mean, again, it's just orders of magnitude more than what it was. I mean, because people, kids are exposed to neuroscience and ideas about the brain and stuff like that, in preschool or not preschool, but in public school and high school now, which certainly wasn't the case when I went through high school. I never heard anything about the brain, and and it's taught at that level now. So it's just hard to compare, then versus now.
Yeah. I mean it seems possibly one of the most important things when learning about the self or talking like what is the brain, what does it do, and what aspects of my experience are controlled by it. And it just, I mean, I think it just brings up so many fascinating questions. And I'm really lucky to be my two best friends are psychologists and psychiatrists, and so I feel like I just hearing the things that they say in their world has I would have never thought about the brain otherwise had it not been that. I would have been like, this is who I am. The myself exists somewhere near my heart, and that's who I am, and I need to navigate the
All
world.
in your
But
brain. It's all in your
yeah,
brain.
yeah, and I think just being around them and kind of understanding how much of this experience is just in the brain is absolutely fascinating. And so a lot of your work does also cover brain plasticity, and I'm excited to get into that because I think there's a lot of connections between that and education. Can you expand a little bit first on what brain plasticity is?
Yeah, all that phrase means is that it changes. Your brain changes as a consequence of experience. I mean, the classic example of that, of course, is learning. Learning is defined, as a change in behavior as a consequence of experience. And that's all coded by changes in brain. And so there's many different forms of plasticity. The most, you know, sort of largest, example of that is just development, going from a baby to an adult, and the changes in brain that take place are just enormous. That's plasticity. Learning's plasticity. Uh, what I study, taking drugs changes your brain. And so any kind of event that changes your brain is just comes under this umbrella term, plasticity. The brain is plastic, it changes. I mean, again, 50 years ago, it was thought that once development ended, that brain was sort of fairly formed. But it's become, we've come to realize over the years now, it's changing all the time. You're breaking synapses, changing neural circuits, and so on. And that's just all examples of of brain plasticity. I mean,
Mm,
you're born, for example, and again, plasticity isn't always growing new things, it's sometimes getting rid of connections. And so the
mm.
biggest change in brain during early development, in infants and early development, is your brain is actually born and neurons are wired together with many, many connections. And most of the plasticity that takes place with brain development is getting rid of them, that is pruning back this sort of overabundance of connections. So
Whoa.
that's an example of plasticity in
Why
development.
does that happen?
It's just that's how we're
The way
built.
it is? Yeah.
We're built the brain. I mean, neurons have an overabundance of connections early in development, and
Wow.
as you learn and develop, you actually form neural circuits by pruning back the
Huh.
overabundance of connections. Whereas in adulthood, it's thought, more often than not, in the example of learning, for example, you make new connections. Uh, but making new connections may mean you make new connections in this circuit, but lose connections in that circuit. But you can think of it as rewiring. The brain is being rewired continuously as a function
Mm.
of experience. The experience could be learning, it could be stress, it could be taking drugs, it could be, aging in as
Whoa.
opposed to early development. Your brain is changing moment to moment all the time. That's
Wow.
plasticity.
I mean, there's two things that sh came up, but well, I want to ask you, are there things that can happen in the environment that changes how plastic a brain is?
Yes, I mean, and so again, I mean, there's a number of examples of that where there are sort of limits on plasticity that can be imposed by things like stress.
Hmm.
Chronic stress may change the ability of the brain to change in certain conditions and certain kinds of ways. Uh, the hormonal environment uh, can alter that. Changes in your immune system may change. So there's lots of different, processes that can alter or
Yeah.
set limits on plasticity.
Do they have connections between brain plasticity and IQ, for example?
Well, in the sense that, I mean, again, learning and being able to learn flexibly and so on is related to brain plasticity. And so anything that, for whatever reason, has limited learning capacity, uh, and to some extent, there's presumably some relationship between IQ and learning capacity, then to that extent, yes, there's a connection. Um,
Hmm. I mean, I'm just thinking how, not
But
neurologically.
there isn't anything. I mean, if your question is there research that directly relates IQ to some plasticity? I don't know of any research that shows that, but just logically, there's going to be a relationship someplace.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking, I've explored a lot of different school settings, and I don't have any neurological basis for this, but one thing that I do find is that the best forms of learning happen when students or just people in general are given the opportunity to make connections that often aren't there. So rather than just studying math for math, being like, oh, math is actually connected to music, which is connected to art, which and art is connected to history, which is connected to like all of these things are actually deeply interconnected with each other. There is no silo of knowledge or information. But oftentimes what ends up happening is the way we either learn or we're taught to think makes it seem as if these are all completely different worlds. And if you study economics, there's no space for you to learn about something else. And I think in a lot of ways, to me, it seems similar to how plastic your understanding of knowledge also is. Like how many connections across these different spaces can you create rather than have these like limited silos where you're like, all my information is uh, just for this one space, you know? And I'm curious. I would want to see it. What are the environments and conditions that allow for somebody to be more plastic? Because I think only then can you make your own connections rather than only following the connections that are given for you, right?
Yeah. And for these kinds of things, I mean, one way to think of it is you're talking about sort of the multiple interacting processes that determine how your brain functions, with plasticity being, one example. And for almost all of these kinds of big, big issues, you can think about genetic influences and environmental influences. And for most things like major psychological function and stuff, roughly it's usually about 50-50. You know, that is, a certain proportion of the variance will be genetic and a certain proportion of the variance is environmental. But even those interact. That is, the environment determines often what genes are turned on, producing what proteins, which determines how things like brain functions. And your genetics, can determine how you shape your own environment. So this the dichotomy between genes and environment is really a false dichotomy. Those are interacting factors. They interact in very complex ways, influence each other, and what you end up with in terms of how your brain functions is due to these complex interactions between genetic factors and environmental factors.
Hmm. I mean, I think this idea of the brain changing is so fascinating to me, primarily because of my own experiences of ex I think when you're traveling, you experience these giant shifts in your quality of life. And every time you move to a new country or a new place, all of a sudden you're provided with this whole new set of challenges. And every time I go somewhere, I immediately am, I can't do this. This is far beyond my comfort zone. And then I just wait 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and by the third or fourth day, my brain forgets what my life used to be like and is just like, this is my life now, and this is what it's going to be like. And then I find joy and peace and whatever else I was finding earlier in this new space, which a few days before I thought would have been impossible.
People are very adaptable.
Yeah. And so I guess the thing that I'm really curious about is when thinking about, and I guess some of this is not even your professional opinion, but just the personal opinion too, of just like, if that's the case that our brain can pretty much adapt to anything, how do we define what a good society or a good life looks like if our brain would adapt and figure out a way to kind of reach stasis in any setting?
Yeah, but don't forget the adaptations are not always beneficial. So you can think of things like post-traumatic stress due to wartime experiences. That's due to a change in brain as well that can render a
Mm,
person basically dysfunctional. So, and other people, won't have that kind of reaction. So, you probably don't want to have a world that has experiences that results in a significant number of people, developing things like post-traumatic stress.
yeah. And what differentiates the people who do versus the people who
Oh,
don't?
that's not well understood. I mean, that's a big research question. What determines susceptibility to things like that?
Mm,
There's enormous individual variation. You can think of that just in terms of responses to stress. There's a huge literature, it's not my field, but there's a huge literature on individual variation in responses to stress, in terms of how it influences brain, how it influences immune function, and so on and so on. And there's just, there's enormous variation. So that's a big research field. I mean, again, it's not my field, so I can't speak to it, but there's a lot of active research trying to understand exactly that question. What determines
Mm,
resilience versus susceptibility to things like stress?
hmm. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would love to place brain plasticity more, the concept of it, like how adaptable is your mind to make your own connections rather than simply just like following and obedience, like seeing what education would look like if that was more of a value than something that might just be like a side consequence. And then,
Yeah, but
yeah,
that's not something sort of intrinsic to brain plasticity per se. That's constructing environments that are conducive to, to positive development. That's not
separate.
neuroscience. That's social and political questions.
Yeah. And so I guess the next thing I'm curious about is talking a little bit about your work in addiction. And so your work in sensitization theory. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so my colleague Kent Berridge and I published a paper in 1993 called The Incentive Sensitization Theory of Addiction. And it's a biopsychological sort of view of addiction. We actually just did a update that was 2025 in the annual review of psychology called the Incentive Sensitization Theory of Addiction 30 years on. Um, and the idea there, I mean, again, you go back in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, most research on addiction focused on the development of what's known as tolerance. Most people know what tolerance is. That is, you take a drug repeatedly and you require higher and higher doses to have the same effect. That's what's referred to in pharmacology as tolerance. And one main view of addiction at the time was as people took drugs, and particularly opiate drugs, you got the development of tolerance. So they took higher and higher doses, which made more and more tolerance. And then when you stop taking drugs, the consequence of tolerance having developed is a withdrawal syndrome. And so everyone's heard about going into withdrawal. And again, at that time, uh, the major sort of biopsychological view of addiction, that is what motivated people to, you know, compulsively seek drugs, was what's referred to in the field as a negative reinforcement process. That is, people sought drugs to avoid the unpleasant consequences of withdrawal, so withdrawal avoidance. And so, again, the basic notion at the time was, well, people first take drugs because they produce pleasure. So that's sort of a pleasure-seeking thing. But as they continue to take them, you get this development of tolerance, withdrawal, feeling bad when you stop. So you continue to take drugs to avoid withdrawal. And so there were a lot of studies on this development, what's changing in the brain to produce tolerance. But it was in the 70s, really, there was a different phenomenon discovered when you take drugs repeatedly. It's true that some drug effects show tolerance, that is, they get less and less and less for when given the same dose. But there are other drug effects that show what looks like the opposite, and it's called sensitization. That is, those drug effects get bigger and bigger and bigger. They grow. So you can give a lower dose if you've had drug in the past and get this, the same effect that you got with a higher dose earlier. And so I sort of ran into this sensitization phenomena. I actually thought I discovered it. I was working with amphetamine. I won't go into why we were doing an experiment. It was an experiment that had to do with sex differences in gonadal hormones, but we were doing it within subjects design where we gave the drug amphetamine, got a certain behavioral effect that we knew was being mediated by, in this case, dopamine. Uh, and then we did some manipulations, and then a month later gave the drug again to see how the manipulation changed the system. We were using the behavioral readout. The experiment didn't work, and the reason was is in the control animals, Animals that had the drug at one point in time, if you gave them the drug even a month later, the drug effect was bigger. That is, and what that said was having the drug at one point in time in your life, a month earlier, changed something in the brain so that you're more responsive to the drug a month
Mm,
later than you were originally. And I thought that was fantastic. I thought the control, it destroyed our experimental design in terms of what we were trying to do. But that was itself a very interesting phenomenon. How can a single experience with the drug at one point in your life, a month later, and this is in rats, and that's a long time in a rat's life, change their brain and change their responsiveness to the drug. And so I thought I discovered this drug-induced plasticity. You can think of this as drug experience dependent plasticity of some sort. Then I went to read the literature, and indeed, this phenomena had been described, and it was known as sensitization, sometimes called reverse tolerance, but it's really not reverse tolerance, it's sensitization. And I started studying that. And so I studied this phenomena primarily with psychostimulant drugs like amphetamine or cocaine. And there wasn't much knowing on that. But again, the focus in the literature was sort of on development of tolerance, not the sensitization phenomena. And so we did a whole bunch of studies, and other people started studying this phenomena, like which behaviors show sensitization, uh, what's changing in the brain to produce sensitization, what kind of variables influence your susceptibility to this form of plasticity, hormones, sex differences, what environment you get the drug in, context, all of these things influence the extent to which the drug does change your brain or not. And so I started to study that phenomena. And in the like in the 80s, leading up to the early 1990s, I mean, I don't know, published 20, 25 papers or so on this sensitization phenomena. And in none of those papers did I mention addiction. Sensitization wasn't seen at that time to be something to do with addiction. It was thought to be an animal model of what's known as amphetamine psychosis. That is, if people take drugs like amphetamine repeatedly, they'll almost invariably eventually develop what looks like a paranoid schizophrenic state while on drug that's known as amphetamine psychosis. You see that in
mm.
the movies sometime. What's that movie with uh, I can't.
Split? No.
It's not Scarface or something. I think it's
I'm trying to
anyways.
think which one.
The guy. It's a famous actor. The guy's using cocaine all the time, and you can see him getting more and more and more
I think
paranoid.
it is Scarface, right?
I think it is Scarface.
Yeah,
Something
yeah.
more and more paranoid. But that's a real phenomenon. It's a well-studied phenomenon. The development of this amphetamine or cocaine psychosis, and so
Mm,
this sensitization phenomena was thought to be an animal model of what's changing to render people hypersensitive to the psychotomimetic effects of the drug. Um, but it really wasn't related to addiction. What happened was, and so was at that time a lot of studies. My studies were mostly on the sensitization phenomena. We'd shown all the many factors that influence it, and we'd also shown a neurobiological correlate. And the neurobiological correlate was animals that were sensitized to the drug showed greater dopamine release. So one thing amphetamine does and cocaine does is cause a big surge of the neurotransmitter dopamine in regions like the nucleus accumbens in the brain. And animals that have had amphetamine in the past, if you give them a fixed dose of drug, you can see greater dopamine release in the sensitized animal than the non-sensitized animals, which probably explains why they're hypersensitive to the drug, because you're getting a bigger, you know, effect on the main neurotransmitter that the drug acts on. So we knew all of that. Uh, the way it came about that we started to relate that to addiction was through some studies that were done by my colleague Kent Berridge. And at that time, you can ask, so what does dopamine do in reward? It was known that dopamine was important for reward, but a researcher who was in Montreal at that time, Rewires, had the dominant theory, and it's still, if you go onto the internet and search dopamine, you'll still see this today, although nobody believes it anymore. And that's dopamine's the brain's pleasure transmitter. Dopamine, is what produces, release of dopamine, what
It's
produces,
serotonin, right? That is.
that's
That's a whole other thing.
serotonin's involved in mood. But the dogma for many years was dopamine was the brain's pleasure transmitter. Um, and again, as I said, if you just Google dopamine, you'll get all kinds of memes showing that kind of thing. But what Kent was doing, and the reason people thought that was, and the reason Roy Wise proposed that was, is that if you blocked dopamine, and say animals were self-administering amphetamine or cocaine or a drug like that, and you put it in an IV catheter, they'll press a lever to give themselves the drug.
Yeah.
If you blocked dopamine, the animals would extinguish. They would stop responding, and they stopped responding in a pattern that was very typical of just removing the reward. Like if they were bar pressing for food and you
Hmm.
stop delivering the food, they show a very particular pattern of extinction where they stop responding. Why did they stop responding under dopamine blockade? Well, it's as if you removed the reward. And so, what Roy Wise hypothesized was what dopamine blockade was doing was removing the pleasure of
Hmm.
of receiving the reward. And so that's why they stopped taking drugs. That's why they stopped, taking food, because it wasn't rewarding. It wasn't pleasurable anymore. And so that's where
Hmm.
the idea came from, that dopamine mediates pleasure. And it's logical. You stop working for something that previously was rewarding. Why? Well, maybe you don't like it anymore. And the reason you don't like it anymore, if you drop block dopamine, is that dopamine is the transmitter that mediates the extent to which you feel, pleasure from rewards, whether they're drugs or whether they're food. Kent Berridge, on the other hand, at Michigan at this time in the late 80s, late 80s, was doing studies on the neural basis of food pleasure, if you will. But he was using a task that didn't require animals to work for the food. He was measuring oral facial reactions to sweet tastes or bitter tastes. And it turns out if you put something sweet in the mouth, rats and people and monkeys and dogs and cats will go. "Hmm." They make what look like
Yeah.
pleasure movements. If you put in quinine that's very bitter, you know, you, and you can quantify these oral facial, patterns, and get quite nice measures of the extent to which a given taste stimulus seems to be pleasurable versus aversive. And so Kent thought, well, given that Roy Wise is right and that dopamine mediates pleasure, if we remove the dopamine, then what you should get is sweet things should no longer be seen as pleasurable.
Hmm.
And so we did that experiment, that is, destroyed the dopamine in the brain, then squirted tastes in their mouth, and there was absolutely no effect whatsoever. Sweet, sweet things were rated just as nice as in control animals, and bitter things were rated just as aversive as in control animals. There didn't seem to be any effect of removing all of the dopamine on the ability of the animals to make judgments about at least taste pleasure, suggesting that dopamine's not involved in mediating pleasure. And this
Quick
was
question here. Quick question. How did you know that that facial expression was connected to pleasure?
and again, Kent had done a whole series of different kinds of experiments,
Hmm.
sort of quantifying, and it's always an inference because in an animal they can't tell you. So,
Yeah.
but based on a whole variety of experiments, Kent had a pretty good evidence that they were giving you a readout in terms
Hmm.
of the animal's hedonic reactions to the taste. And
Hmm.
so, given that that's true, although that's an inference, but given that that's true, it seemed that dopamine didn't wasn't needed for animals to make normal hedonic judgments about
Hmm.
the pleasantness or the aversiveness of taste. Later on, it became known, for example, and that's also true in Parkinson's patients. Parkinson's patients, of course, have dopamine depleted. They're not particularly, they're apathetic about doing things, but they make absolutely normal judgments about things like pleasant taste. There's no
Mm,
impairment in terms of judging whether something's pleasant or unpleasant, particularly in terms of taste. So, anyways, this experiment was in 1989, and we had to write a discussion section. And we were saying that what it looks like dopamine doesn't mediate pleasure. But it
mm,
was, again, there were lots of experiments at the time that said that dopamine was involved in mediating reward in the extent to which when you remove dopamine, animals would tend not to work for rewards anymore. Uh, and so that's where we came up with this distinction between what we ended up calling wanting, in quotation marks, and liking. That is, dopamine is involved in the extent to which you desire and are motivated and willing to work for something, but don't seem to be involved in the extent to which they are liked once they're consumed.
mm,
And so we suggested there was a dissociation in the brain between wanting and liking. So incentive sensitization theory came from just putting together the information we had from our work on sensitization and other people's work on sensitization. If you take drugs repeatedly, you get more and more and more dopamine release. If dopamine mediates not liking but wanting, that is the extent to which you're motivated to work for something, then as you take drugs repeatedly, you should want them more and more and more as you become
yeah.
more and more sensitized. And so incentive sensitization theory is just basically that. It's an argument that the critical change that takes place in brain as a consequence of using drugs that leads to addiction is a sensitization in these dopamine systems that renders an individual
Mm,
hyper reactive to drugs and particularly to cues that are associated with drugs. We knew from the sensitization literature that once an animal sensitized, that lasts for years probably.
mm.
It's a form of plasticity that's very, very long lasting. Tolerance, on the other hand, is gone within a week or so. But sensitization is very persistent.
Oh, interesting.
So, incentive sensitization theory is the idea you take drugs, you sensitize the brain system, and it stays sensitized. And that results in you being liable for relapse for
Yeah,
very long periods of time, even after you stop taking drugs, months or years. That brain system still changed and you're still can be susceptible to relapse. And so that's the basics of incentive sensitization theory.
interesting.
Arguing that rather than tolerance being the fundamental change that leads people to have high motivation to take drugs, it's this sensitization phenomenon that leads
Yeah.
to pathological wanting. That's the problem in addiction.
So this is fascinating. Also, you're a great storyteller. One question I have is, does this expand past just drugs? So, for example, if someone's addicted to pornography or if someone's addicted to sugar, like, does this expand just past drugs?
Yeah. So in 1993, we pretty much confined our ideas to addiction. But since then, over the last 30 plus years, there's been a lot more focus on so-called behavioral addictions and the extent to which behavioral addictions, which can be overeating, binge eating, gambling, sex addiction, pornography addiction, these are the so-called behavioral addictions. Uh, there's been a lot more research, again, over the last 30 years on these so-called behavioral addictions, and they're again, it's not as well understood in terms of how drug changes brain, but there are clearly lots of parallels, and quite a few researchers have driven parallels between the incentive sensitization that takes place with drug use and what looks like a similar kind of sensitization phenomena that underlies things like gambling addiction. Gambling is probably understood better than any of them, but there's studies on sexual addiction, a bit on pornography. So the answer to your question is yes, people have suggested that there are parallels to behavioral addictions. The precipitating factors that result in the sensitization are different, presumably, because in one case it's drugs, and in the other cases It's not clear always what the precipitating factor is that leads to the change. Um, but a number of people have argued, for example, with ultra high, processed foods. There's a woman named Ashley Gerhardt of Michigan who's argued that indeed consumption of those kinds of foods, high sugar and stuff like leads to sensitization like changes
Mm,
uh, in a similar manner as to the drugs. So,
wow. And so how does therapies around this now change? Is it primarily around, yeah.
uh, so there, there's not huge advances in terms of therapies. Uh, I mean, from our point of view, the most effective therapy would be something that would reverse this sensitization phenomenon, this sensitized neural system. Uh, and we don't know of anything that does that in any way that you could think of as a therapy. Um, you're seeing work coming out now with the GLP-1 drugs that people are taking for weight control that are also influencing dopamine systems and down-regulating dopamine systems. And you're seeing some trials of using those kinds of drugs for addiction now. We'll see how that turns out. I mean, that's all in its infancy. Um, but it also, again, if you think that the fundamental problem is this problem of brain plasticity, is if you will, just think of sensitization as a form of experience-dependent plasticity. Learning is experience-dependent plasticity. Drug sensitization is drug experience-dependent plasticity.
Mm,
And if that change in brain is what's fundamentally wrong. You can also, instead of thinking about biological approaches, you can think about psychological approaches. Psychological approaches change your brain too. I mean, that's when you learn something, you're changing brain. And so a lot of psychotherapeutic kinds of approaches are aimed to change brain. And so one can also then think about what kinds of psychological approaches might work best in terms of, controlling this sensitized neural substrate. Some things we know well. Get out of the context. You know, going back into a context where you use drugs is a big, precipitator of relapse. Change context, change the people that you're hanging around with, change your life situation. All of those things can serve to dampen down this sensitized neural substrate. Uh, what kind of intervention might reverse it? I don't know. That no
mm,
one's come up with. But
mm,
the fact people often hear, well, so drugs change your brain and stays changed forever, and think, well, that makes it all sound very hopeless. But as I said, our brains are changing all the time, and if they can change in one direction, they can potentially change in the other direction to tamp things down. And so
mm,
we should be looking at both sort of psychological as well as biological approaches to do that.
mm. Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating stuff. I mean, I did speak to Kent as well, and he talked a lot about these separations between wants versus likes, and kind of how that ends up playing in the brain. And I mean, it was just that to me was actually a really helpful framework for me to understand some of my own behavioral addictions, like how to maybe think about it, and it just gave me another framework to understand.
Okay.
And I'm curious. I really want to ask you a few questions just about your career in general and just in retrospect, kind of having experienced the full kind of recently retired since this January, so it's been 9 months. When you first started, did you ever feel like your career would take you in the ways that it did? Was all of it in plan?
No, 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 it's all serendipity. Uh, and in fact, what I did my PhD thesis on wasn't anything to do with drugs and addiction or anything like that. It was my I studied hippocampal theta, hippocampal electrophysiological signatures and stuff, which had nothing to do with this. I got into the addiction field, as I said, sort of by accident. I've been studying the sensitization phenomena, and getting in to study the sensitization phenomena was also an accident. That is, I told you we were doing an experiment for a completely different reason,
Yeah.
but just discovered. I mean, this. this effect of having one injection of the drug influencing behavior for a long time. And I remember at that time, again, I was a young assistant professor, sort of looking for, what am I going to, to build a research career on? And I remember at that time reading a book by B.F. Skinner, Skinner of the Skinner box, a famous a psychologist, a learning guy, had written a book called Advice for Young Scientists. And I remembered this line in this book that said, if you're studying whatever you're studying, if you're studying and you find or fall across something that's more interesting what you're actually studying, drop everything else and go and study that. And I remember when I saw this data, I first saw the data of the effect of that one injection of amphetamine on behavior a month later, thinking, this is way more interesting than what we were trying to do. And indeed, I dropped everything else and I started studying that. Now, so that took me into studying the sensitization phenomenon. And so that was just total serendipity. I didn't know sensitization existed. As I said, I thought I discovered it until I then went to the literature and saw, well, people have described this sensitization phenomenon before, but there was very, very, very little work being done on it. So I just started to work on it. Getting into addiction was again an accident in a sense. It was collaborating with Kent Berridge on this taste reactivity study where we took out all the dopamine, and was an expert in making dopamine depletions with a neurotoxin. So we worked with Kent to make these dopamine depletions, and then Kent used his technique of this taste reactivity, looking at, squirting the taste into the mouth. We fully expected just to prove, another study proving that Roy was right. That is, when you removed all the dopamine, that the ability of animals to make, pleasure or to experience pleasure in terms of, taste would go away. And then it would just be another paper confirming that dopamine is involved in pleasure. But we didn't see that. And that
Mm,
changed just that result changed the whole career because, well, if that's wrong and dopamine's really involved, that took us into reinterpreting all of the sensitization stuff and how it might relate to addiction. So again, nothing's
mm,
planned. And often this is the case in careers. You just sort of fall across things and you just have to be prepared to change how you think about things. And
mm.
my career has just been a series of those kinds of, whoops, that
Yeah.
takes you off in this direction.
I mean, as a scientist, I think one of the things that I'm really curious to know about is in your experience of other scientists and being in the space, what do you feel like is like the ultimate motivation that drives people to conduct science? Is it just mere curiosity, or is there a belief that by understanding these things, something else will arise?
I think for most scientists, the main motivating factor is what you just said, is curiosity, just finding out things that no one knew before. It's when you run an experiment and see results and data that you're the first person that's seen a particular phenomena, that's very exhilarating. And
Mm,
so I think that's what drives and motivates most scientists is curiosity. Yes, I mean, people are also motivated, particularly in the health sciences, biological sciences, of some treatment for some disorder at some point in the future. But the fact of the matter is, the day to day, a lot of science is very tedious, boring day to day, running of experiments, uh, and to motivate on a day-to-day basis. I think it is things like curiosity, just discovering things. It's good to have that long-term goal, but most of us know we're not going to come up with a cure for, whatever in our lifetime. So it's a long-term goal, but it's not what really motivates most people day to day.
mm. How do you feel like you sustained your curiosity for 45 years, 47, even longer maybe?
It's because in the examples I've given, it's ever changing. That is,
Yeah.
you never know what's going to happen. And so multiple times during my career, it's gone off in this direction or that direction. And that keeps it interesting because like like I say, it's not like you have a path and you can look, 10, 15 years down the road and see where you're going to be. You don't know where you're going to be because your results are going to take you in many different directions. And that keeps it's always new. It's always interesting. It's always unanticipated in terms of what's going to be, what you're going to be doing in a year from now or 2 years from now. I often say writing grants is a bit of a sort of almost silly exercise in a sense. When you write a grant for the NIH, you write a grant and you say what you're going to do for the next 5 years. Any good scientist has no bloody idea what they're going to be doing 5 years from now. But you have to write down and say in your grant what you're going to do, 5 years from now, uh, because that's how the funding system works. The fact of the matter is, in the first year, as soon as you start, things are going to happen that are going to change the trajectory. And that's
Mm,
good. I mean, if anybody actually knows what they're going to be doing 5 years from now, because it's all planned out, it's probably not even worthwhile doing the research because you already know the outcomes,
because
right?
you already know. True. Yeah.
Yeah. It's and a lot of people don't appreciate this about science. I mean, you have to be prepared to change. People want you to be able to write a grant and know what the outcome is.
Mm,
You want to, you don't want to know what the outcome is in advance. Otherwise, you are not discovering things. And so
mm,
there needs to be in science, and this is always tension between science and policymakers and grant funding organizations who want sort of a guaranteed, outcome kind of thing, whereas that's not how science works. And so there's that tension's always there. And what's really important in terms of the advancement of science is just let people run with their ideas, and you will get much better outcomes that are unanticipated than this sort of over planning of things. But that's
mm.
philosophy of science kind of thing. Most
But
scientists, most
yeah.
scientists want the freedom just to run with their ideas. And to the extent that the systems and organizations that fund science can do that, the better the outcomes are going to be for society at large.
Mm. I mean, I feel like even in the last 2 decades of being mostly conscious, it's been fascinating to see how many things have changed in science and technology, and it leaves me half scared and half very excited to just see what lies ahead and what are the things that we're going to know and uh, where does all of this knowledge take us and what is the world of tomorrow look like? And so I feel like do you feel like the world as a whole has changed in ways that you anticipated
Well,
or not
what
really?
no, not in terms of how I anticipated. The change that's sort of the biggest that you can see is the sort of exponential growth in knowledge. So
Yeah,
when
it's
you look over
insane.
the years in terms of, you know, just the growth in knowledge, that is, you know, taking off in a way that's almost impossible for any individual to comprehend. Like I said, in that 1993 paper, the incentive sensitization theory of addiction paper, which has been cited a lot over the years. Uh, but in that paper, I don't know how many citations to the scientific literature we had. I'll make up a number, either 200 or 300. But we were literally able to cite pretty much any paper on that topic that had ever been published. That's almost impossible to do today. I mean,
Mm,
because instead of being in the hundreds, you're talking about in the many thousands.
mm,
So the literature, the magnitude of the information in the literature that's out there is just enormous, which tends to lead to people becoming more and more specialized because you just can't grasp it all. It's very, very hard to get your arms around in an entire literature these days. And so that's tough. So in terms of starting out as a scientist, kids starting out now, like as graduate students or new assistant professors, know so much more than what someone like I knew, starting out, because there wasn't that much to know back then.
Hmm.
It's a much more, I think it's much more difficult for people, starting out in science these days. Now, on the other hand, they've got all these fancy toys and tools and stuff that we didn't have that allows them to answer, you know, questions that we couldn't even pose in the past. Um, but there's a lot more to know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it feels infinite, and I think but with this advent of AI, I'm curious like how yeah, it's just I feel like we've entered a new world in some ways, and I'm really curious to see how that influences knowledge and what that looks
Yeah,
like.
AI is going, I mean, God knows where it's going to go, but it's going to change the way things are done dramatically, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all just like waiting until it happens now. We're just like, all right.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
again, when I started out, you wanted to find a scientific paper, you went to the library, into the stacks, you pulled off a journal, and you got it, and made a copy of it. There was
that's
no there
crazy.
were no PDFs online. There was nothing accessed by a computer. When I
Yeah.
started out. And so, I mean, over my career, just the way you go about getting the information, you need to say plan an experiment where you have to review the literature. Now, you just go
Mm,
on your computer, you know,
it's all there. I mean, and yeah,
there,
it's
it's there. It's just like it's just no comparison. So things move inordinately faster,
yeah. I
which
mean,
is a plus and a negative. It's
yeah.
sometimes you can argue that it doesn't give people enough time to just sit and think sometimes, which is also important because you're
Mm,
having to keep up with this huge amount of literature that's coming out all the time.
yeah. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. This was a lovely conversation, and I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I am so excited to keep season 10 running, and I hope you've been enjoying. And as per usual, stay re educated.